Ukraine is an issue which has pretty much united people in Britain. Russia entered a war of aggression. Ukrainians have every right to resist. But in a speech to spring Tory party conference, Boris Johnson decided to introduce division where none was needed. Let's take a look.
And I know that it's the instinct of the people of this country, like the people of Ukraine, to choose freedom every time. I can give you a couple of famous recent examples. When the British people voted for Brexit in such large numbers, I don't believe it was because they were remotely hostile to foreigners. It's because they wanted to be free, to do things differently, and for this country to be able to run itself.
So voting to leave a bloc of nations which we voted to join in the first place is the same as fighting off a war of aggression from an invading neighbour. And who are Remainers in this analogy? Are they Putin, or is the EU Putin and the Remainers are just people who tolerate Putin? In any case, if the comment was intended to provoke a reaction, it had the desired effect. Gavin Barwell is a former Tory minister and was Theresa May's chief of staff. He said, apart from the bit where voting in a free and fair referendum isn't in any way comparable with risking your life to defend your country against invasion, and the awkward fact that the Ukrainians are fighting for the freedom to join the EU, this comparison is bang on. Talk Radio's Julie Hartley-Brewer also wasn't impressed. She said, even as a staunch Brexiteer, this is totally cringe from Boris Johnson. Comparing the vote to leave the EU with the Ukrainian people fighting for their lives against a foreign invader is an insult to their bravery and sacrifice. And the comment doesn't seem to have gone down too well in the cabinet either. Speaking to the BBC, Rishi Sunak struggled to defend Boris Johnson's choice of words.
The Ukrainians fighting the Russians is like the British voting for Brexit. Would you have made that comparison?
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister was making a direct comparison between these two things. Clearly, they're not directly analogous, and that's not what he was saying.
He quite clearly did make a comparison. They were in the very same sentence. Britons, like Ukrainians, have the instinct to choose freedom. I've got the entire quote here. He was comparing them to. I'm just asking, would you have
I think
made that comparison?
he was making some general observations about people's desire for freedom. Clearly, those two situations are not directly analogous. The Prime Minister doesn't think that because they're clearly not.
Would you have used those words? Would you have compared them so directly together?
I think, to your point, he was not directly comparing those two things. He was talking about freedom in general. Those two situations are not directly comparable. No one thinks that they are. The Prime Minister doesn't think that they are.
So Rishi Sunak doesn't think Boris Johnson was making a direct comparison. Let's get up Johnson's exact words so you can judge for yourself. I know that it's the instinct of the people of this country, like the people of Ukraine, to choose freedom every time. I can give you a couple of famous recent examples. When the British people voted for Brexit in such large numbers, I don't believe it was remotely because they were hostile to foreigners. It was because they wanted to be free. Now, that looks like a direct comparison to me. The Ukrainians and Brits are both freedom-loving people. The Ukrainians have expressed that love for freedom by fighting off the Russians. In the case of Britain, they expressed it by voting to leave. Speaking to Sky Health Secretary Sajid Javid also denied the obvious.
What I heard from the Prime Minister was basically the desire for self-determination in everyone, no matter what country they're in, no matter what their circumstance, is strong. I don't think in any way he was connecting the situations in Ukraine and the UK. And if we want to know what the Prime Minister thinks about Ukraine and responding, I mean, we can see for ourselves in terms of the support that he's provided, rock solid support compared to any other world leader.
You don't think it was at all crass for the Prime Minister to make that comparison or to allude to a comparison? I mean, the Prime Minister...
I don't accept that he was comparing UK and
He mentioned
Ukraine.
one and he mentioned the other in the same point.
His point was about the importance of self-determination and people, whoever they are, wherever they are, they have this strong feeling of wanting to have freedom and determine.
I'm just gently suggesting that the self-determination, shown by the Brits who voted to leave a political and economic union is not the same as the self-determination shown by people who are picking up guns and firing on invaders.
And he wasn't saying... I think it's spurious to say that he was connecting somehow UK and Ukraine in that way.
Barnaby, what did you make of Johnson's comments and those attempts at a defence?
Well, actually, I thought the comments were quite telling. I mean, I didn't agree that our response should be limited to sort of horror and outrage that he could make the comparison. I wanted to know why he made the comparison. I thought he made it because he doesn't really care about freedom in either case. I don't think Boris Johnson supported Brexit because he wanted British people to be self-determining or because he wanted to smash the imperial European Union. He's lining up with it now. I think he supported Brexit because he thought it might be useful for his own career in the Tory party. And perhaps if there was an ideological basis, because he thought it could create a kind of Singapore-on-Thames of free trading, buccaneering British capitalism. I don't think it had very much to do with freedom, except the awful kind of freedom that Boris Johnson imagines, which is the freedom to make lots of money. Similarly, I don't think he really cares about freedom very much in the case of Ukraine. If he did, he could have done one very simple thing right at the beginning of this crisis. It was the basic demand that the left and all decent people made, which was to ensure visa-free travel for Ukrainians so that Ukrainian refugees could get here in huge numbers. We had the farce of a British government saying that Ireland was opening itself up to mass crime because the Irish government was willing to quickly do that after the Brits said it was simply impossible to do it. Equally, if Boris Johnson thinks that people have an instinct to choose freedom, I want to ask him who he thinks has that instinct. Does he think it's just people in Britain and just people in Ukraine? Does he think the instinct to choose freedom also exists in Saudi Arabia, where 81 people are murdered by the state so their blood could fill the red carpet for Boris Johnson's arrival as he goes to plead with them to turn on the oil tax? Does he think the instinct for freedom exists in Palestine, for example? So I think there's a deep disingenuousness to the language of freedom, which makes it very fitting that Boris Johnson can use it so casually disingenuously in comparing, obviously highly inappropriately, a referendum vote in Britain to leave the European Union and Ukraine being prevented from actually entering the European Union, as lots of Western Ukrainians want to do. I also think it's interesting that Boris said in this clip that people don't hate foreigners, and that's why, and so we shouldn't think that the Brexit vote was an anti-foreigner vote, because Ukraine has provided in some countries of Europe a kind of model for refugee protection. The enormous work that Polish towns and cities are doing to integrate Ukrainians, to ensure that they are able to go to school, kids quickly, that they can go to hospital, that they can work, that they have homes to live in. We never had a refugee crisis in these last few years in Europe. We had a crisis of unwillingness, for whatever reason, call it racism if you like, to welcome people fleeing despair. And don't make the mistake of thinking we welcome Ukrainians now because they're white. The causality is almost the other way round. We've decided that Ukrainians are white because we dislike Putin, and so it serves the interests of the British and American and European states to see Ukrainians as heroes. That's not a very stable phenomenon. I don't know that Ukrainians will always be welcomed, or that Eastern Europeans will always be welcomed in the West. We have to have a politics of supporting refugees and demanding the kinds of protections for them that some Ukrainians are now getting for everyone, as well as demanding that all Ukrainians get those protections. When Eurostar is able to offer free travel to Ukrainians across the Channel, it raises a very sick and a very dark question about why it is that so many people drowned in that channel, unable to get free tickets on Eurostar, why so many people fell from lorries and drowned and died trying to get across the English Channel. So I think we need to take from this moment a very different approach to refugees and migrants, and to be critical of the fair weather friends of refugees and migrants. And then lastly, I'll just say something about the sort of falsity of a split between Britain and the European Union that the Prime Minister suggested here. We heard just a few years ago that there was some kind of fundamental difference between the politics of Boris Johnson and the EU. Now, of course, they're both exactly lining up in lockstep. And some socialists who end up on the same side, cheering on someone they called a fascist a few years ago when he prorogued Parliament, because Boris Johnson and those socialists are both supporting the EU and NATO. So I think this raises big questions about whether Leave Remain really was a kind of clear dividing line in our politics, or whether in fact there are common interests that unite people like Boris Johnson and people like Ursula von der Leyen, and they're not the interests of people around the world, including desperate Ukrainians who are now bombarded and can't find safety and sanctuary in Britain while the government dithers.
Really well put, that point about Ukrainians aren't welcome because they're white. They're white because they're welcomed. I think that's a really pithy way of putting a super important point, because it does seem a bit like people of memory hold the fact that one of the big drivers for Brexit was that Poles had been racialized as some other that weren't welcome in the country and who we didn't have any control of whether they got here or not. And if Ukrainians are white, so are Poles. So, but it didn't serve the interests of the government at that point to say, no, we should have compassion towards these people. So they were racialized as an other and were, a target of xenophobia. As you say, it could also be, this welcoming attitude towards Ukrainians could be somewhat flimsy, and potentially it will reverse when the Tories and other fingers of the establishment decide it's no longer in their interest to treat them as, very welcome. Similar thing actually will be happening with Hong Kongers. So people from Hong Kong, they are people of East Asian background, of course, but they are seen as welcome. The Tories say, these are the people we want in Britain. partly because they are seen as, and this is just, I think it's correct that we, give visa-free travel to people from Hong Kong. I think it's correct that we give visa-free travel to people from Ukraine. But we should recognize why there are these very, very blatant double standards when it comes to our immigration policy. And it's because the UK government sees letting in Hong Kong migrants as a FU to the Chinese Communist Party, and they see letting in Ukrainian migrants or refugees as an FU to Vladimir Putin. So it's not really a moral thing, it's a geopolitical thing. But all refugees are welcome wherever they're from. So this isn't to say that we should be skeptical of the right of Hong Kongers or Ukrainians to come here.